For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sash Numali. Anti-apartheid activist Stephanie Kemp joins me today to discuss her book, Through an Unforgettable Storm, The Forging of a Long Cadre. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi.
The title of your book describes you as a loyal cadre. What principles have you been loyal to throughout your life as an anti-apartheid activist?
I think, well, it is throughout my life. I was very young when I got involved. And I think overwhelmingly at the beginning and still today, it was a question of justice that was obviously not being practiced here. And particularly white racism, which as I spread my wings a bit, I came from a very narrow background, but as I spread my wings, I discovered it wasn't confined to South Africa, that in fact the injustice and anti-black feeling amongst whites is really quite an international thing.
Now, you and Albie Sachs were exiled in Britain in the 60s, and you eventually married there. What was your life like in the UK while you were trying to actively fight apartheid?
Well, it was quite extraordinary because when I left South Africa in 1966, the South Africa I lived in was very white. I mean, everything was white. And I reached London where I remained. We were quite a tight-knit ANC sort of group. And I found myself living for 24 years in exile in a kind of South Africa that I was actually struggling for, where Africans were in the majority and in the leadership, whites were a tiny minority. This is in ANC circles. Yeah, that was the one side. So it was quite an extraordinary experience to live for so long, quarter of a century, really, in the kind of situation that should have been here. The other side to it was that for all that time, because I did underground work even in London, where I was in exile, it was the stress and the tension, because you knew that every word you said, everything you did, potentially could get people killed. Every person that tried to befriend you, you immediately were suspicious, and even people that were quite close to you, you were constantly questioning whether they were loyal cadres, whether they were okay, whether it was just, 25 years of non-stop. I can remember teaching my two sons when they were around 10 years old not to open the mail, for instance, to be very careful. I used to look under my car in the mornings. It's quite difficult to live like that for such a long time and set against living in quite a fantastic demographic surroundings.
Now, you often came across former President Thabo Mbeki while in exile, and in one encounter he told you that you were being patronizing to African comrades. Can you tell us about the context of this?
Yeah, we were very young. We were in the youth and student section of the ANC, which at that time the ANC's membership was open only to Africans from 1912 till about 1970. And so in exile they set up youth and students to bring in people like myself who were loyal cadres, but in a sense we were divorced from the struggle situation. And we had meetings in the ANC offices in London, and so it was a mixed group of young people meeting. And after the meeting, I was with Thabo in another office and I said, "Hey, I wish whites would just learn to be quiet and to just wait for a bit and give some space to other people to talk." And that's what upset him. And he said to me, "You're being very patronizing, making out, I suppose, that Africans can't speak up for themselves." But I still believe that. I still think we, as whites, very often have difficulty listening, and we jump in. I used to find even teaching that the white students would like jump in immediately, like we know everything.
Now, you credit Joe Slovo as being the great love of your life, and you write that he influenced your political thinking more than anyone else. What was your relationship like with him, and what was the political influence that he had over you?
Well, I worked very closely with him politically, you know, so he was actually there, which is, you know, a lot of people influenced me. Chris Hani, for instance. But I think what I came away with from Joe, not only his complete dedication and absolute integrity as far as his political life was concerned, but it was the question that I believe went throughout all the years of struggle, right from the beginning of the 20th century. And that was the tension between issues that one can relate to non-racialism and the tension with African national liberation. So even it was expressed by left people, by communists, other communists, as a class struggle, which would cut across the national question. And then the question that what the main contradiction in South Africa was that it was there was 80%, 82% African majority that had nothing, whose land had been stolen, and that was the issue that needed to be dealt with. I don't think it has been dealt with, and I think that's part of the problem.
And what was your relationship with him like?
Very undemanding, you know. I did whatever he wanted me to do, and I mean, life was about politics. You know, a couple of times we kind of got to Paris and things, but otherwise it was really politics. That's even now, it's about all I talk about. Don't have much space for other things, I think.
Tell us about your arrest in 1964 and about your interrogation at the hands of the Apartheid Security Police.
I already was a member of the Communist Party. By then, the underground, I'd been recruited into the clandestine Communist Party, but I also got involved with a sort of white liberal sabotage organization. And so it was for that I was arrested. In some ways, it's a relief to get arrested because, again, you're living with this tension waiting, you know, for somebody to come. And they came. It was a Saturday afternoon, I think. I was on you know, out in the sunshine in Cape Town on the pavement, and these men appeared in a car, and, you know, a bit like... I think being detained is shocking, you know, suddenly being from those days, 1963. Before that, when people were detained, they tended to be held together in large communal cells, although whites were always separated. But from 1963, I think, you were totally and utterly isolated. I mean, the only people you saw were your interrogators. And you were in this solitary cell, like a box, with, if there was a window, it was high up, so you had nothing. I mean, they didn't even give you a Bible. You had nothing to do, nothing except to just think about what was happening, and your thoughts start going in circles. I was interrogated a lot, and then after about 3 weeks, they said to me that there were interrogators coming from Cape Town, and you know, they really lord it over you. They enjoy that you're powerless, and they say, oh, you're going to sing like a canary, you know, really kind of pleased about that. And then they beat me up, or one guy beat me up and hit my head on, I had long hair like yours. He grabbed my hair and hit my head on the floor until I was unconscious. And after about 2 years, it came to court after I'd been released. Eventually came to court, and they paid me out a small amount, you know, that sort of thing. So detention is hard. I think even if they don't hit you, it's hard being in solitary confinement, not knowing what's going on.
You write, and I quote, "White Afrikaner history of suffering, bravery, and purity dominated my childhood environment." Can you explain what you meant by this?
Well, I'm saying that slightly ironically, but that is the kind of history that white Afrikaners had, and I think to a large extent still have. That, you know, we had to flee from the Cape in the Great Trek in 1838, always away from the British. So the British were persecuting us, and we were always going away. In fact, that was the main story, I think, was a sort of against the British. Africans really were in the background. You know, they were coming to murder and rape us, but this wasn't the dominant issue. The dominant issue was the English. And in that story, including the Boer War, you know, there were always very brave people who stood up, and especially women who were left on the end. And to some extent, you know, there's a truth in that. But of course, you didn't hear why we've kept on moving away, you know, that it was British coming in with liberal, abolishing slavery, for instance, you know. So the reasons for these things happening were not so brave and good, but that was the history you grew up with. That the, you know, poor us, we were treated badly by the British, and we had to be brave. And when I was a child, I mean, white Afrikaners were treated as if they were stupid, often dirty, by English South Africans. So you had that feeling that you weren't good enough. You know, I mean, not many English people would deign to speak Afrikaans, whereas if you wanted to get on in South Africa, the white Afrikaners had to learn to speak English. So there was this unequal situation between the two, and white Afrikaners like to be victims.
When did you first notice discrimination against black people, and how did you respond to this?
I think the extraordinary thing is that right until I went into exile, I didn't know any black people at all. I mean, whatever I did, and ever passionately I felt and learned to feel against apartheid, because I had to overcome, I often relate it to what's going on now with the ANC. You have to overcome a huge emotional thing to pull yourself away from that Afrikaner story. I think it is quite extraordinary that I was preschool, and I had two older sisters, and they went to school. My father was principal of the Swartland Laerskool in Malmesbury. So they went to school, and I was left alone at home. And so I played with the woman who worked for us, with her two little kids. And they were only allowed to play between the kitchen door and the door of their room. And there was a sort of open drain, and it struck me as being very unfair, is the way I would look at it then. And I never spoke about it. You know, we were in quite a patriarchal family. I mean, you didn't speak much. But it stuck with me. And then when I was about 10, there was a Jan van der Beek festival in Cape Town, and going from Malmesbury to Cape Town was a huge journey. You know, it was a great big thing. It took longer than it does today. And we got there, and they had all stalls and installations and showing, you know, how well the whites had done all these 350 years. And then suddenly there was an installation behind glass of people, and they were bushmen, and they were in little loincloths with bows and arrows, and I was startled, you know, that these people were behind glass on display. But worse than that, this man suddenly caught my eye, and we just looked at each other, and it really made a very, very profound impact on me. So by the time I went to Port Elizabeth in high school, I went from what was essentially a small town of farming community, the Swartland, Malmesbury, to this industrial city for high school. And I think that made a big impact on me, that suddenly there were African people walking the streets, but in shocking poverty, you know, but they had a bearing and a demeanor that wasn't like the farm laborers who were very obsequious and so on. So I think Port Elizabeth made quite an impact on me.
You write, even our souls were whites, when describing what it was like as a white person living in a world where black people were discriminated against. Why did you make this comment?
I think I wrote it in the context of just how white everything was, and I think it's very difficult. I find it quite difficult to remember how white everything was in my world, in the world of the tiny minority of whites. You know, so there was a life going on somewhere else that we weren't really privy to. If you came across black people in general, they were domestic workers, they stayed out of the way and were as quiet as possible. And so in a sense, nothing is challenged in your life. You can be who you are as a white person. And there really is nothing to modify that except something, you know. I mean, people used to always ask me in exile, sort of magazines and people, how did I, as a Afrikaans, white Afrikaans child become, or young person become involved in the struggle? And I always try to find answers, you know, about Calvinism, about this. I could really never find a satisfactory answer until I was writing this memoir. And I suddenly thought, actually, it's the wrong question. That the question that needs to be asked, why is it that something that was so self-evident to even a preschool child somehow missed the rest of the whites, you know, or the majority? You know, why didn't everybody see what I could see, that, you know, it wasn't right that this woman lived in a very dark room. That was the other analogy. She lived in this completely dark room that fitted, Radi her name was, it fitted an iron bed where she slept with these two little boys. No lights, no electricity. And it was the same structure where our car stayed in a double garage. We had one car and the car was in this vast double garage with fluorescent lights, you know. I mean, that struck me before I went to school, that, you know, this car's doing very nicely and poor Raleigh stuck there. I mean, it was obvious, and it was obviously not just, you know.
How were you recruited into the SACP, and why was becoming a communist easy, as you say?
By the time I went to UCT to study physiotherapy, I knew I was completely anti-apartheid. By then I'd come to terms with the fact that as a white Afrikaner, you're supposed to love your government. And I'd managed that, you know, that this, I'd learnt that this wasn't an act of God that created apartheid. It was people, a government, my government. So when I went to UCT in my first year already, the very dramatic first year, because it was 1960, and I'd hardly got there when Sharpeville Massacre happened. And after that, lots of things happened that year, including the first attempt on Verwoerd's life, but also rural people in around Lusikisiki, where my mother had grown up, revolted again. So there was just one thing after another that whole year. I watched a march of PAC people in Cape Town within weeks of my arriving there. People marched, and Philip Hosana from Langa and Nyanga, quite a long way. They walked from there to Caledon Square. And I sat on the pavement at Caledon Square, and it was, you know, when I think about it, the massacre had just happened. The people were walking totally quietly, peacefully, but the power of numbers, I mean, the whites, including the police, were so scared. It was quite dramatic. So I went around looking for people to help me to understand better, and particularly to see what to do about what was going on. And I didn't really relate to students on campus. so I found a place to volunteer. It was the Defence and Aid Fund that was legal then. And I volunteered. They put me into a committee that dealt with finance. And it happened that that whole committee was full of white, communist, older women. And I had never, ever encountered anything like it. I mean, these women, they didn't talk about movie stars and the sort of thing I grew up talking about, I suppose. All they talked about struggle. And I'd never heard the struggle. I'd never heard any of it, you know, and they just sat there and they were arguing about, no, so-and-so, you know, didn't behave in a principled way and so on. And my mouth dropped open, and they didn't care how they looked. Well, they didn't seem to, you know, whereas I'd grown up with, you know, everything had to be just so, your bag had to be the same colour as your shoes. And these women, and they were women who'd been for a very long time in the Communist parties when it was still legal, including Albie's mother, whom I met her before I met him. And one of the women, Sarah Carnison, she ran a boarding house, and she started inviting me for supper. And it ended up I went there every Thursday night for supper. And it was obviously they were checking me out. I was under some sort of probation. So when I was 20, that started when I was 18. When I was 20, they recruited me because, of course, Communist Party was clandestine, so you didn't go into an office and sign a membership form. They invited me. And it was easy because the whole way communists looked at the world, certainly in those days, the analysis that they made of how society moved forward and how you got from feudalism to this, and it moved. There was a logic in it that really appealed to me. You know, that this was no longer a bewildering world. This was a world where things made sense, and how you fitted into that and how you contributed. I also liked that, the fact that they expected you to take, you know, to be responsible for how your world was. So you had to contribute to that. I liked it. So that's why it was easy for me. They made sense. And they were also very non-racial. I never got the feeling that the whites were in control, even though I'm mixed because of the situation, because of the dangers. In fact, I only had white communists around me. But they talked constantly about people like Lux Maatsalwandle Ngudle, who was the first detainee to be killed in those detentions. They talked about people with great admiration and respect in a way that, you know, was unique in my experience.
Now you write, I used to be an Afrikaner. What did you mean at the time, and have your feelings changed?
Well, as I said, I had to really work through a very deep emotional, ingrained loyalty to white Afrikaners. And it took me quite a lot of effort to break from that. And when I broke quite deeply. I stopped speaking Afrikaans when I was in my teens. When I said that, it was in the late 80s, if I remember, and I met the Reverend Beyers Nordier in London. It was a very emotional meeting. I just fleetingly met him because here was an Afrikaner who'd chosen to be a good person. So I was very torn because now I'd rejected my own Afrikaans thing. So I said that to him. And then he said to me, what happened? And I said, I became a South African. And then again, Thabo Mbeki was a person that influenced me in this because at that time, I was part of an ANC delegation that was meeting women from inside the country. It was a time when we were meeting with, various Afrikaner groups. So I anticipated that it would be a very Afrikaans group of people who would come. And I said, I'm not speaking Afrikaans to these people. And Thabo looked at me and he said, why are you allowing these people to hijack our language? And I didn't like respond because I didn't quite know what he was talking about. And I left it. I didn't speak Afrikaans at the meeting. And when I came back into the country in 1990, I started, meeting Afrikaners again in a way. I mean, in the ANC there were one or two, but, it wasn't a big issue. And I found myself and now I was in a sense free from the struggle in a way, so I could make more personal choices. And I found myself still very emotionally bound to being an Afrikaner. And I remembered Thabo's words, and I started, of course I hadn't spoken Afrikaans for a very long time, and I still choose where I speak, but one of my sons went to live in Cape Town, and almost all his friends were black Afrikaans speaking people. This really threw me. But I loved being able to speak Afrikaans. I love the language, and I love being able to speak it in a context that was not racist. And yes, I've embraced being an Afrikaner more and more. I mean, I've got, a history, but it's good to be able to locate myself in a non-racial situation. That's not the Afrikaans chauvinism that I grew up with that excluded everybody. Here, if people are hostile to Afrikaans, fair enough, then I don't speak it. Or if they're arrogant, then I don't speak it either.
Now, you also write that shame has followed our freedom. Can you explain this?
Well, I think it's fairly self-evident, but the recent figures that came out that said that 30 million South Africans are still living in poverty. And when they talk about poverty, I mean, the majority of people, those people are living on less than 800 Rand a month. I just think it is shameful. This is a wealthy country. It's a country with the biggest inequality between rich and poor. The poverty is not, in my view, necessary at all. I think the ANC government has given up caring and is caring more about personal self-enrichment. I once spoke to Chris Hani about why we'd become communists. We were the same age. I knew him from when we were about 20. And then I met him again in exile. And we were sitting in East Berlin, in fact, and we started talking about how we came. I think his father was a communist, so he had it a little bit easier than I did. And for both of us, Chris was highly intelligent and very well read and highly educated. I think he studied Greek or something, classical Greek at Cadre. But he was also very emotional. He felt things like the struggle, the injustice, very, very emotionally and deeply. And he said, as I did, that we became communists because of our hatred of poverty. So to have gone through the struggle and to be here today and find, of course we always thought we were different. We wouldn't do what other countries had done. We were exceptional. Well, it's quite clear we're not exceptional, and what I find unbearable is the persistent poverty. And when I say poverty, I mean serious poverty. And you see it. I mean, you don't have to go anywhere. It's on your television. You see the sewage in the streets. You see children playing amongst tins. You see Marikana. I happened to come home and turn on the television to watch the news. It happened. I was watching. It's not, these things aren't hidden from us. They're there for us to see. You have to work very hard not to know what's going on in South Africa today.
Now, are you still a communist? And what is your hope for South Africa?
Yeah, my son actually said I had to deal with that question. Communism was really a wonderful place to be in the 20th century. You were full of hope. You believed that the world would change for the better, and you believed that people were good. You had heroes, you believed people were good. And then I think by the 21st century, so much, with the fall of the Soviet Union, so much came out. You had to confront so much that was dreadful, that went wrong. And even now, if you look at China, Vietnam, those countries really have a class of oligarchs. You know, they into an economy that looks very little different from any other economy in terms of competition and so on. So I don't know what has happened to communism. I mean, communism has sort of left me. If I could hold on to all the fine things from the 20th century, it's still the best. But I think I'm also more realistic. I think that capitalism can do better than we're doing. You know, capitalism in Sweden or Finland, those are capitalist countries. They do much better than here. We don't have to compare ourselves with the United States, for instance. You know, we don't have to compare ourselves with any of those countries. We can aim to have a kind of country that it goes a long way towards mitigating the worst of capitalism. So what do I hope? I think I see what's going on now as, you know, I don't know why we ever thought we could go from 400 years of the kind of subjugation that was going on in this country and sort of walk forward into a nice democracy. You know, I mean, it's really not logical. So I think that where we've gone wrong is there's probably an inevitability as part of a post-colonial apartheid era, long era. And I think that in a way, what's gone wrong is now in the hands of all of us. You know, it's no longer a tiny minority doing this to us. It's now our problems. It's we who are going wrong. So I think, yeah, I hope that we can find kind of political leadership that is committed to making this a better country, an even better country, and that it has a leadership that is both strong and has integrity, doesn't self-enrich. I never used to believe in leaders, not really a communist way of looking. You look at the people. I think the people are there. What they need is a leader that they can believe in again. So that's what I hope will happen.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
That was anti-apartheid activist Stephanie Kemp discussing her book, Through an Unforgettable Storm.